So I'm Herb Raffaele. I spent many years working on international wildlife conservation issues, particularly in the Caribbean. I lived in Puerto Rico for 7 years, and Cuba happens to be a place that I'm especially interested in. My specialty is the birds of the Caribbean, but I'm also interested in other aspects of the islands. And because its cultures are so special, you can't help but be excited about the history of the islands and Cuba in particular. So this is to give you some background on a movie, Cuban Food Stories by Osorio Soto. It's an excellent movie. You'll enjoy it thoroughly, but it pays to have some background to understand where he was coming from when he created this movie. So this is the national dish of Cuba. This is called ropa vieja, which means old clothing in Spanish. Interestingly enough, it's not originally from Cuba. It's originally from the Canary Islands. But Cuba, interestingly enough, that's what Cuba is. Cuba is a sort of a melting pot of historically, of course, the Spanish, African slaves, the indigenous peoples. And so practically everything in Cuba is a mix of different things, including a lot of American things. So with that, Cuba is very well known for its culture. This is a local cathedral, very historic, Baroque. Of course, its housing, all Spanish architecture, wonderful colors. Probably most famously among ourselves, we think of the historic cars there from the 1950s. And of course, it's extremely famous for its music. It has a whole diversity of music, a lot of which was created originally in Cuba. The scenery is magnificent. These are limestone hills full of caves and spectacular stories behind those. And so to get to now to the film, we need to go back a bit, and this is a dictator from the 1950s, Bautista, just before the Cuban Revolution. And he was a strong man supported by the United States. And along came Fidel Castro. And some of you may know that history. He started a revolution in '53 that lasted quite a few years, and it wasn't until 1959 that he took over Cuba. Well, he took over Cuba. He made it communist. The United States was less than happy to have an island 90 miles away that was communist. And so the Cuban exiles convinced John Kennedy to reinvade Cuba, not with the U.S. military. The U.S. military partially played a role, but basically the Cubans played the main role. And so that resulted in the famous Bay of Pigs invasion, which involved several hundred Cubans. Didn't last very long at all. They were all captured. It was a total debacle. And we could spend a lot of time just talking about that particular invasion, but that's not what this is about. So that was '61. The United States was less than happy. Cuba became even more paranoid than it had been. So what Cuba did was it made even a stronger alliance with Russia because it was having all these problems with the United States. The Cubans came up with the great idea of putting intercontinental ballistic missiles in Cuba, which led to the famous Cuba Missile Crisis, which again is a very powerful and important story, a very important part of our history. And so that happened in 1962, to the point where Cuba ultimately and Russia withdrew the missiles. And the U.S. was less than happy. And so at that time, during the missile crisis, started an embargo of Cuba. So we move on. This is the alliance between Castro and Russia. And then moving forward 9 more years, the Soviet Union collapsed. So, of course, that was another very historic event. And what you see in this particular slide is the fact when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet Union was a coalition built around Russia, but of a whole bunch of other countries that were part of the satellite nation to Russia, and that was the USSR. And so all of these countries that were so dependent on support from Russia all of a sudden lost it. And one of those countries, even though there's not a boat representing them, was Cuba. So Cuba, which was getting all this support, all of a sudden now was receiving nothing. And so that brings us to the time of our story, because it was exactly after this crisis took place for Cuba that our author, who at that time was a young boy of about 11 years old, that he went to Cuba with his family. So that's a really important historical context, because he went there. I don't think he could have gone at a worse time. So Cuba was in dire straits. When I say dire straits, I mean if you got one bar of soap a month for your family, that was probably all you got. And so these are food lines in Cuba at the time of what was called the special period. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba went into this special period, which Cuba is much better off today than it was, which we're not going into that, but that arguably a lot of people consider that special period still existing today. So there's no definitive date for its end, but it was a very terrible time in Cuba. It was I'd been in Cuba around that time, and we could talk about a lot of stories of what things were like then. Here are the streets. So this was not uncommon. If you walking down the street and you would like a pork sandwich, lechon, for a few cents you could get a pork sandwich, delicious. But again, that was the world of Cuba at that time, and in fact, there are parts of Cuba you could probably still get this today. So that brings us to pretty much what the movie's about. So this young boy lived in Cuba during the early parts of the special period. His family then left, came back to the States, and then he grows up in the States, becomes an adult, and decides, gee, I'd love to go back to the country where I grew up as a kid. And so that brings us to the movie, which again is about 18, 20 years later, and this is what he sees in Cuba when he gets back. It's not like there was some huge amount of resources that have been poured into the country. So what you see is this dilapidated buildings that have not been taken care of for decades. And yet every place where there's a little bit of money, you see this incredible renaissance of development. And so here you see one house was able to restore itself, even though obviously they still have to put their laundry out because there's not good electrical system. This is a Cuban taxi. There's a Cuban taxi today. So things have not really changed. Even in Havana, you can get cars to drive you around, but in most towns in Cuba, you'll still use a horse-drawn cart. This is the local supply truck that brings merchandise to your stores. And the biggest change in Cuba of late is that people can now invest their money in things. This is called a Casa Particular, a personal house, but it's personal. It's used to rent out to tourists. So it's one of the exciting things for tourists today is that rather than go to a big hotel, you go to somebody's house, you get to know the family, they cook for you, you live in their home. It's an absolutely spectacular opportunity to get to know Cuba. And up until a few years ago, this was illegal. It was illegal for a Cuban to possess $1 in American money. So Cuba has changed a lot since the early times of the special period. It's developing a lot. It's being much more hospitable to tourism. That's the inside, a very typical inside, a lot of mosaics, very stylish homes. So the movie. So Soto, what he did was he traveled around Cuba because he wanted to discover, he was growing up in this special period when things were so tough. He considered that a lot of recipes and traditional foods that he had known when he was young had disappeared, and he wanted to reconnect with them. So he traveled around Cuba to find them, and that's what you'll enjoy from the movie. You'll see different parts of Cuba, different scenery, meet different people. And what I wanted to highlight are these particular points. So one of the first, I believe the first person you'll see in the movie is a fisherman. And he loves fishing. I mean, he's like a born fisherman, except he's a trained nuclear physicist. He's a trained nuclear physicist. What in the world is he doing as a fisherman? The reason he's a fisherman is that when Cuba was being supported by Russia, near where he lived, they built a nuclear power plant. So they were building this nuclear power plant. They trained him and his wife to become nuclear physicists. Then when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was it. So that plant is just still sitting there. There was not another brick was put into it. And so everybody's lives changed. Just like the coronavirus is changing our lives, this was a much bigger change for them. So here you meet this nuclear physicist, and he is in love with fishing. And that's Cuba. Cubans take what they get, they bear it incredibly well, and they see the most glorious things out of a very simple lifestyle. So he's a very special person. My beautiful plants greet me with tears of dew. This is a conversation with just an ordinary Cuban person in the countryside, and look at the quotes that come out of them. I have never heard a quote like that coming out of somebody I chatted with in the garden club. Whatever you do in life, you have to do it with love. Intoxicating happiness. The recipe for ceviche, which you'll see this Cuban fisherman making: salt, oil, garlic, onions, and lime. It's a perfect chemistry that has nothing to do with anything. It's just magical, talking to Cubans and how they perceive the world. And so you'll see it in the film. It goes by very fast. And so I wanted to call your attention to it because it is very important. It's really what Cuba's all about. So at the end of the film, after he visits these various chefs, not necessarily chefs, but people that are known for their cooking at least, he makes this appeal, which again, it's important to recognize. And that is to set aside our differences. And what differences are you talking about? The differences that he's talking about at the end of the movie are the political differences that I described in the beginning of this presentation, and that is the Cuban exiles. The Cuban exiles, primarily in Florida in this country, have tremendous political influence. They're the ones that are affecting U.S. policy with regard to Cuba. And so the U.S. policy to Cuba is, again, pretty much an embargo-type mentality of starving the island to death, which he finds incredibly frustrating. And so what he's appealing to the audience, to you, about is to say, hey, enough is enough. Let's recognize that Cuba is an important country that needs support, and let's not keep trying to strangle them politically. And so that's the final point in the movie. So with that, here are the sites numbered that he visits on Cuba. He obviously got around quite a bit, which is pretty challenging in Cuba because it's not the simplest island to travel on. And so I hope you enjoy the movie. Thank you.